A very good evening and welcome to this evening's episode of On the Record. My name is Vuyo Mvoko. In tonight's show, Pravin Gordhan and his team have made the allocations. One of the questions we are asking tonight here on the program is, how do we ensure that the money goes where it is supposed to go to and doesn't end up in wrong hands or in the waste bin? We have several guests lined up to help us answer that question, starting with the Auditor General, Mr. Kimi Makwetu. First up, though, the Minister of Finance's comments that inspired our choice of focus for this segment.
We want our government to function effectively, our people to work in dignity, with resources for their families, decent homes, and opportunities for their children. We want to see progress throughout our land, in agriculture, in manufacturing, mining and construction, in tourism, science and research, sport and leisure, trade and commerce. I believe it is within our grasp to achieve this future. It, however, requires bold and constructive leadership in all sectors of society, a shared vision, a common purpose, and the will to find common ground. Above all, we need action, not just words. Let us unite as a South African team, sharing our skills and resources, building social solidarity, defending the institutions of our democracy, and developing our economy inclusively. We believe we do have a plan to firstly manage our finances in a prudent and sustainable way. Secondly, reignite confidence and mobilize the resources of all of our social partners. Collectively invest more in infrastructure to increase the potential growth of our economy. Give hope to our youth through training and economic opportunities. Protect South Africans from the effects of the drought. Continuously improve our education and health systems. Accelerate transformation towards an inclusive economy and participation by all. Strengthen social solidarity and extend our social safety net. The budget rests on the idea of an inclusive social contract, encompassing an equitable burden of tax and a progressive program of expenditures. The budget relies on institutions of good governance and a public ethic that values honesty and fairness. If we act together on the basis of these principles, as public representatives, civil servants, business people, youth, workers and citizens, we can overcome the challenges of tough economic times and difficult adjustments. In acting together, we can address declining confidence and the retreat of capital, and we can combat emerging patterns of predatory behavior and corruption.
Well, joining us now from our Cape Town studio is the Auditor General, Mr. Kimi Makwetu. Auditor General, thank you very much for joining us, especially the last words that from the Minister, combating predatory behavior and corruption. The question, I guess, is where do we begin? What should we be doing? We know the money has been allocated. The work has to start. The question is, how do we ensure that there's no abuse?
Thank you very much, Vuyo, and good evening to all the viewers. I think if you go back to the speech of the minister, he says that this budget relies on institutions of good governance and a public ethic that values honesty and fairness.
Yes, the clip we just
played. And I think if we expand on that, the minister is communicating to us the need to do more with less, as well as to focus on making sure that there is no abuse in the utilization of public funds. This is important, Vuyo, I think, in the context of this budget, where we want to also insist to public servants who handle public funds that it is better for them to make sure that when they make decisions in respect of the public funds that they are entrusted with, that they make decisions that would almost be similar to decisions that they would be making for their own personal finances. Because I think this budget that the minister announced today requires a public that is ethical and is able to drive fairness into the system.
Now, in your last report, you lamented a slow progress in addressing audit recommendations with regard to key internal controls, but also with identified risk areas. Looking at the budget and for the reasons you have just alluded to, how confident are you that this time around the public servants you are mentioning who will have the responsibility of managing this money will indeed manage it as you are advising the way they are managing their own personal money?
I think in this environment, Vuyo, if you look at the value that could be derived from putting in place very strong controls in the system of financial management, we would make sure that we narrow the space for those that may want to abuse these limited resources, as well as make sure that we achieve more with minimum resources, meaning that when we provide services in the different front-facing areas like Home Affairs and all these other departments, we make sure that we do something once and complete it so that there is no opportunity for additional cost to be brought into the system. And I think that if proactive steps are taken by those that deliver services for government, it will prevent much more harsher measures that will be inevitable should there be no saving of the current finances that are available. Secondly, when one looks at the collection side of things as well, I think it is important to also indicate that the public honesty and fairness with which finances are handled is not only on the expenditure side, it's also on the transparency with which taxes are paid by all taxpayers.
Well, I mean, speaking of proactive steps, in your last, if I may go back to your last report again, you speak of leadership-driven efforts. Can you hear me, AJ?
Sorry, there's a interference on the sound.
Okay, let me repeat that question. I'm saying, speaking of proactive steps, you do say in your last report that you emphasize the need for leadership-driven efforts in trying to combat corruption, but also in narrowing the space for abuse, as you put it.
Well, if you look at the reports that we've issued in the past, Vuyo, there's been quite a high level of unauthorized expenditure and the likes of irregular expenditure. And I think if one reads into the statement that the minister issued today, what we are saying is that there should be limited opportunity for that type of expenditure to be tolerated and accepted in the public sector, because the funds that would have been available to finance that are no longer available, and the markets are very tight even internationally. So I think the message that has been coming out to institute very strong leadership controls is about making sure that leadership, when they commit government finances, they are confident that they will achieve the intended objectives. It starts with that tone at the top before it can get to the finance department that will process invoices.
Well, of course, one of the big issues has been over the years the issue of no consequences, that a lot of people get away with this, or people do this precisely because they know that they operate in a space of very little or no consequences.
I guess it remains an important question, Vuyo. If you look at any system where you put leadership into an environment where they must enforce rules, and if these rules are not observed, and the people who did not observe them are innocent of their consequences, you would obviously come to a conclusion that abuse will be tolerated in an environment like that.
The 1, 2, maybe 3 things that the people who will be handling the money should take into account and put ahead of everything else?
I guess when there's wastage currently, and that wastage is not reversed, it normally leads to much harsher measures. And those measures, we all know that sometimes they translate into people losing jobs. So it's one way of protecting jobs that exist to make sure that there's no wastage with the public resources. And I think that is one primary consideration all of the people who handle government finances must always have at the back of their mind.
Auditor General, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will.
The Auditor General, Mr. Kimi Makwetu from Cape Town. Well, time to take a quick ad break. When we return, Corruption Watcher's David Lewis on how we can help make the Finance Minister's wishes on integrity, ethics and good moral behavior true or a reality. We'll also be joined by analysts Dick Forsland and Viv Govender, who will weigh in on the budget, looking at the extent to which it speaks to the poor, to students who want free education and other areas of major national concern. That's after this short ad break.
Mancosa, Southern Africa's leading distance learning institution, accredited, affordable and accessible management education programs, higher certificates, diplomas, undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. Register at Mancosa and be part of Southern Africa's leading private business school. Visit our website mancosa.co.za. Mancosa, management education reimagined.
How great would it be to have Sia back for this reunion?
He's been traveling Africa for years. He's impossible to get a hold of.
We know what he drinks.
Let's find him.
Yeah!
Do you think it works?
Hey, guys!
I'm coming home, coming home. Tell the world that I'm coming home.
It all comes together with a castle.
Are you the person we're searching for? The guy who steps up, way, way up. The queen of the pop and lock, and whatever this is. The party train conductor, all aboard! The answer is yes! You are that guy, and we salute you, party comrade! Join the movement online.
Welcome back, and if you've just joined us, you're watching On the Record. And for this part of the program, we are taking our cue from comments made by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, where he says budget 2016 relies on institutions of good governance and a public that values honesty and fairness. And for it is by doing that, or by joining forces, that we can combat predatory behavior and corruption. And joining us now is David Lewis from Corruption Watch. David, from what the minister said, I'm sure you can't agree with him more.
Yeah, I do. I have to say I found this a pretty inspiring talk today, speech, budget. I mean, in fact, I think one of the most inspiring presentations I've heard from a South African government leader or political leader for a long time.
Well, I guess the question is whether civil society organizations like yours are able to really rise to the occasion, given just how positive his comments are, and the fact that he was able, or he had the guts or the courage to actually say the things that many members of the public actually wanted him to say.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the ball is now in our court, and the challenge now is with us. I mean, I really was very encouraged by the way in which he stressed the importance of civil society participation in essentially auditing and monitoring the conduct of the public sector. I mean, you have to ask the people who sort of need the toilets and who need the roads and who need the facilities that public resources provide. You need to ask them whether they're getting them, and they'll tell you, you know. And, you know, there's one little passage in this budget that I guess will go largely unnoticed, but which really stood out for me, was his putting in place a portal that will allow local government participants to see what is meant to be spent in their local area, and whether it's being spent or whether it isn't being spent. And so, what he's doing is he's making government more transparent to enable people to audit it more closely. So it wasn't just, platitudes about accountability and integrity and whatever. It was actually he's promised to put in place mechanisms that will make it possible to do that without, taking to the streets necessarily all the time. So I am very encouraged by it, and I agree with you.
But do people really need that to take action? Do they not know? Because they feel it, they experience it.
Yeah.
I mean, people in a township or in a village know whether they don't have water. They don't need to be told.
No.
They can see for themselves when they don't have electricity, and then they will act when they are fed up.
I agree with you. But there's a difference between informed action and simply action. When you're not getting what you want because government has said that they can't afford to give you what they want, or the resources are not there, that's one thing, and you may or may not believe that, and there are processes for dealing with that. It's a different thing altogether when you've been promised something and you know that actually money has been given to your local government to provide it to you, and you're not getting it then. And you need to be able to tell the difference and know the difference, and you need to know who your enemy is. In the former case, you might not agree with the national government and its priorities, and you act politically accordingly. In the latter case, you know that it's your mayor and your councillor and your local official who's not responsible, and that's where you concentrate your action. So it's about informed, active citizenry, not just about the right to protest and demonstrate, which is there, but to do it in an informed, intelligent way. And I think that's what he's promised to provide, and I like that.
Well, I mean, the Auditor General in his report has spoken in great detail about where some of the problem areas are, but from a watcher, that corruption watch, is where do you think some of there are things that we take for granted but which contribute immensely perhaps to the problem of corruption? What are the things that are perhaps obvious but which we tend to overlook?
Well, there are a range of things. I mean, there are poor systems that are vulnerable, and one that he spoke about a lot today and he's been speaking about for a long time, including in his previous tenure as Minister of Finance, are procurement processes, and a lot is being done to correct that. I mean, at the other end of the spectrum, and you essentially raised this with the Auditor General, is the question of impunity. The notion, and people see this, that if you're politically powerful and you're rich and well connected, you can get away with the proverbial murder in this space. And that's very discouraging, and that goes to questions of integrity and accountability. It also goes to questions of law enforcement. And one of the most serious contributors to corruption in our country is the woeful state of some of our key law enforcement institutions and of the National Prosecuting Authority. So those are very urgent things to correct. And you're right, the Minister of Finance can't do everything. There have to be complementary measures. But I think, within the ambit of his considerable influence, he's done a lot today to sort of make me sleep a lot better tonight, I have to say.
What about the complicity of the private sector, for example? The minister in that clip we played earlier speaks about how we need to combat predatory behavior and corruption, and to many people it's really about the role of the private sector in encouraging and actually fueling corruption.
Yeah, look, I mean, in talking about procurement corruption and the like, I mean, the law has to be enforced against the private sector as much as it is against the public sector official who, as it were, takes the bribe. So there's no question about that in my mind. Both are equally guilty. But he spoke a lot about the private sector today, and principally he spoke about that on the, if you like, the revenue side rather than the expenditure side, about tax evasion, about illicit financial flows, about transfer pricing. Difficult stuff to control, and South Africa is by no means alone in finding it difficult to control. But again, he clearly appreciates the importance of it, as he would as a former tax official. And again, he's identified it as an area in which action is to be prioritized, and we're doing a lot of work in that area, and we'd be happy to, in our little way, to lend him whatever support it is that we can, because I think he's right. And I mean, that is, if you like, private sector. That is private sector corruption writ large, actually.
Any area or thing that you think he may have missed or didn't speak much about that perhaps you would have thought or you would have wanted him to put a great deal of emphasis on as well?
I have to say that there isn't anything that jumps out at me. I think he covered all the bases. I mean, I think the macroeconomic core of the budget, I think, is appropriately moderate on either side. It doesn't slash, and it doesn't ignore the need to restrain it. I'm very impressed, and this has again been an aspect of his ministership all along. His emphasis on frugality. He hasn't always been successful in persuading his comrades to downgrade from 7 series to 5 series, but he's taking it on again, and I think that's good. In the greater scheme of things, it may not amount to huge amounts of money, but it amounts to a huge sort of exercise in responsibility demonstrated to the citizens. And so I found it a very truly impressive performance and impressive content.
So even where he has not succeeded before, he keeps trudging on and is not giving up, nor should we.
No, nor should we.
David Lewis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Lewis from Corruption Watch. Well, after the break, 2 of our economic commentators talk about the budget, but perhaps the areas that have been the focus of some of the events that we've seen throughout the country over the past couple of weeks and months. That's after this short break.
As stories are broken around the world, SABC makes sure you do not miss out. As the stories unfold throughout the day, News at 8 updates all newsworthy stories worldwide. Globally, we are there. Locally, we leave no story untold. Make a date with News at 8 every Saturday and Sunday on SABC News, Africa's news leader. Malema, when pregnant with her first daughter, Relebohile, knew that she wanted her daughter not to experience any identity issues. This is when she decided to look for toys that resembled Black as Beautiful.
I think for me, it was also just to get our girls to have some sense of identity, some sense of belonging.
I grew up having black and white dolls, and going to a multiracial school, I did not really see color. So for me, it's this thing of she should actually know what her true identity is.
Join your host Puleng Mulebadze on Bupilong every Friday at 17:30.
Welcome back. Well, I'm now joined by Viv Govender and Dick Forsland as we continue to unpack this year's budget, which was delivered by the Finance Minister earlier today. Let me start with you, Viv, if I may. Lots of issues on the nation's psyche over the past, couple of weeks and months. In particular, let's start. I should rather say with education. Did the minister adequately or address the issue of education to the extent that you thought he would?
Yeah, look, I mean, he's obviously going to be constrained by the budget, and he's giving a bit more money towards the tertiary education side of the equation. You know, obviously with the fees must fall protests that of last year and continuing this year, it was a necessity to actually add a bit more funding to these organizations, because if they don't get the funding from the students, they must get it from government. But that being said, I think that if you look at the amount of money that South Africa spends on its education system, the output that we get, the outcome that we get, doesn't quite match that amount of money being spent. There is something very broken in the system beyond just the money being spent in terms of the quality of the graduates from both the secondary institutions as well as the tertiary institutions. I think if you look at mostly at the universities, you're not going to find the real problem. It's mostly happening earlier in the system, and there is quite a bit of money. If you look at the amount of money we spend compared to other countries that basically match us or easily beat us in terms of international ratings, we spend a bit more than most people.
Okay. Dick Fosland,
Yes.
did the minister meet your expectations in terms of the allocation and also the other things he said around education?
No, he didn't. The demands of the fees must fall movement and demand for insource, and I think it's in this budget, it's not even on the radar. I mean, the government reallocates 16 billion rands, but it will not make the fees fall in higher education, and the project of insourcing the workers who were outsourced 15 years ago, it will not be possible. I mean, the budget also indicated the number of students in higher education will increase from 1 million to 1.1 million over 3 years. And in fact, if you take the real expenditure, if you count away inflation, so to speak, and you see what is the allocation per student over these 3 years, then in fact the allocation per student is falling. And I think that this will be a big disappointment to the fees must fall movement. It is not addressed this demand. Given that there was a political space before this budget for increasing the taxation of high income earners, surprisingly, the tax increases on high income earners was very timid. It was done through letting inflation affect the system of tax bracketed inflation gives an allocation of some additional 7 billion rand. But at the same way, the government takes it back from itself, so to speak, by continuing to increasing the credit you can make for medical insurance. So if you look at the sum of the whole thing, in fact, on the individual level, there's a across the board decrease in the taxes has been cut. Because the credit for you get if you are using medical insurance, it will on the individual level it will balance the tax increase that's come from so-called bracket creep. So, but the political space was there for increasing the personal income tax on high income, but the government didn't take the chance. So I think it's a disappointment, and that also goes for the issue of social grants. The social grants increased by 6.1 to 6.4%, but already now in January, the inflation that hits the poor, those who are receiving these grants, it's higher than the inflation, the headline inflation. And I don't understand why the Treasury continues to have the headline inflation, which is reported in the newspapers, why they continue to have this as a benchmark for the social grants. This is not relevant for those who are receiving for the childcare grant, for the pensions, etc. You must use the inflation rate that hits the poor. And this year also, the expectation is that food inflation, which is already 6.8% in January, that it could go well above 10% this year. So I think really it spells trouble, and austerity is already hitting the 16 million people that are receiving social grants. And given that there was a space for substantial tax increases on high income earners, it's really a big disappointment, I think.
Okay. Viv, do you agree? Just on the allocations to students, do you agree that essentially the allocation is falling per student, and that it's really not what the minister tried to do is actually not going to help much?
Yeah, look, I mean, you can't go and, but if you have a fixed pie in terms of the amount of money coming in, yes, there can be adjustments in terms of the revenue for taxation, but that's also going to have negative effects in terms of the growth of the economy. But if you do have a fixed pie, I mean, it's very difficult to justify giving massive increases in terms of grants effectively to students via lowering fees dramatically when you have, like it's mentioned before, some really poor people in the country. So if you look at what would have to be involved, having, for instance, free education for higher education for university students, you'd be talking about people that are going to be becoming the upper income earners in the economy, getting many multiples of the amount of money that you're allocating per year to the elderly, to the destitute. You're talking massive amounts of money going towards a group of people that are going to end up becoming the upper income earners in the country. So that's the difficulty you have to measure. And also, for instance, factors such as insourcing are going to be higher cost. The reason things are outsourced is because they become cheaper. If you want to insource something, it's higher cost. So you can't
necessarily true though.
Virtually true, because the reason that you're outsourcing is to reduce the cost of the service. You outsource your gardening services, your cleaning services.
Well, it may be a cost you may be reducing the cost as a university, but if you look at the number of people and how much they are earning, those people, the number of people that are involved, the workers themselves, and the amount of money that goes to each and every one of them, you may actually be shortchanging. I mean, so many people.
People, of course, but I'm talking for the university as a cost center here. The university obviously has to spend more money because it has insourced a number of people versus outsourcing them. So you're talking about taking the university, you can't get more money from fees. Telling the university, you have got to spend more money on insourcing certain parts of your services that you had outsourced. So it's basically telling you spend more money and yet you have less money. So there's obviously got to be some kind of thing that has to give here. And the question whether or not we can have free tertiary education, that is possible. I mean, it's not a thing that hasn't been done elsewhere in the world. But in a situation like South Africa, where will that money come from? Where do you allocate the money from? And you can't just go and say, tax the high income earners. There will eventually be nowhere near the Laffer curve yet, but there is going to be a situation where you get about 50% or so, where people are going to basically be making choices more based on taxation than based on economic good. If you make 100 rands and more than 50 of those rands goes to government effectively, and in fact it's more than the situation right now if you consider all the different taxations, but if you're talking about a significant amount of the money goes to the government, you are going to make choices economically that's going to basically be focused on minimizing your tax burden as opposed to basically just out there making a economic contribution.
Mr. Forsland, could taxing the rich more not be a self-defeating exercise?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, if you would increase the tax rates and the taxes on also the small middle class and the high income earners and the super rich, well, when it comes to the middle class, and if you finance free higher education, well, the middle class, they will get this money back several times because they will not any longer have to pay fees for their sons and daughters going to university or to FET colleges. So it's in their interest that the tax revenue to the fiscus, that it increases. They wouldn't mind. Everything is when you reallocate money in this way, when you reallocate money from the rich to the poor, if working class families, if middle class families don't have to pay any longer fees to universities, then they will allocate their consumption. They will use their money for other things, and that will stimulate the money. When it comes stimulate the economy, when it comes to the high income earners, well, some of them have so high incomes so they can save a large part of their income, and it doesn't go to the domestic market. It doesn't stimulate the economy. So it's a question of moving demand from the upper classes and the middle class to the working class and the poor. And when it comes to the middle class, it is in their interest to pay higher taxes. All of them who have students in higher education, if the purpose of these higher taxes is for the fees to fall. And I wish to point out also that the Wits University, under the moral pressure and the disruptive pressure of the protests of the workers and the students, they have taken a principled decision to insource all the outsourced workers. I mean, you can't. If you sit as a vice chancellor at Wits University and you have an income of 1.3, 1.4 million rand per year, you can't possibly defend the situation where the workers who are making also contributes to making the university function, that they should be content with a monthly salary of 2,500 or 3,000 rand per month. It's morally impossible. You have to solve this situation. When it comes to the fees must fall and the insourcing, well, you have to solve it by taxation, and it will address the huge inequality which we know is socially disruptive in South Africa, which is a source of political instability, constant protest, etc. And if you could calm the situation by increasing equality in the economy, in the end everybody would profit from them. Of course, the upper classes, the very rich, etc., they have always, during all times, been against higher taxes. But I think there's now a pressure from below, and you have a unity of workers and students, and I hope that such a unity could flourish also in other areas, and that would be a very healthy pressure in the economy. Insourcing, I think, should also be an issue from municipalities, because it's almost by definition that corruption takes place where the private meets the public. And you have to insource and have the responsibility of the municipality to take over these sort of key services, which is now performed privately.
Mr. Governor, did the minister have any room to maneuver and just simply chose not to use what Mr. Forsland calls the political space that he had?
Look, he had a great deal of room to maneuver. He was virtually unfireable. I mean, you're talking about in terms of a political situation, Pravin Gordhan at this current point in time is virtually untouchable in terms of his position. Just look at the situation he walked into when the currency was as weak as it was, when there was calls, about this, just how unreasonable the previous appointment had been, etc. So I would think I can't imagine a circumstance virtually where the president would be willing to replace him in the short to medium term. He would have had that kind of power behind him. And yes, he could have made some very strong moves.
What could he have done?
Number one, yes, he could have raised taxes. He has three options he was to raise taxes from.
In an election year.
In an election year, yes. That's the thing. Politically, he had the most power that any politician in a very bad situation could have had. Okay. The reason that we saw the currency fall as it did is because our current situation is not that bad. If you look at our current debt to GDP ratio, it's not as out of king for the rest of the world here. And many countries have better ratings by ratings agencies, have worse current situations than we have. But our trend is quite negative in terms of just the growth of the public sector wage bill, the growth of entitlements, the revenue issues problems that we have. Look, the fact of the matter is the reason that the currency fell was because his assumptions about economic growth for this year and next year are probably optimistic. According to most market commentators out there, most analysts out there, he's been quite optimistic about that. If that is the truth, then the revenue assumptions he's making are optimistic as well. Okay, so he's basically asking for growth of, even though the 1% growth rate we talked about is not dramatically higher than what we've seen in the past. In fact, it's lower than what we've seen in the past. But the economy is weaker than we think. The second part of it is the public sector expenditure. We spend basically almost half the public sector on the salaries for the public sector. And if you look at the trend, I mean, within about a decade or so, with the current growth rates we're seeing with entitlements, the current growth rates we're seeing with the public sector wage bill, but the entire budget would be covered by those two factors, nothing left over for infrastructure building, nothing left over for any other function of government besides those two things.
Well, if you speak to COSATU workers, they still tell you that they're being underpaid and overworked.
Not if they're in the public sector.
They're still being paid apartheid salaries.
And the public sector in unionized worker, compared to a comparable worker in the private sector, is being paid something about 30% more. Okay, this is a huge premium. By far the best paid, in terms of premium here, the elite in the economy is effectively the unionized public sector worker. Okay, in terms of the skills, if you control for skills, control for experience, and look at the payment structure, you'll find that the unionized public sector worker is paid a massive premium compared to a private sector worker. most parts of the world, the functional way the economy functions is, if you're in the public sector, you accept a lower wage for greater stability. So you get, better pensions, better stability. You don't get fired in downtimes, but you get a lower wage. If you're working in the private sector, you get a higher wage usually for the skill set that you have, but you have more instability. I mean, if the market turns down, you lose your job, that kind of stuff. In South Africa,
so is our government not creative enough, or no one even thinks about it?
No, but in our government, the situation is that the best place to be is in the public sector, because for your skill set, you get paid the most. You also get more job security and more benefits coming to you than the public sector, private sector worker has a comparable skill set, does a comparable job effectively. And if you look at the situation like this, you can find comparable things happening in places like Greece, and we know how that turned out. You do have this difficulty when you have a very well-paid public sector, which is not as productive as it should be. I mean, according to most measures, it's not. And because the public sectors, obviously, workers vote for government, there's a bit of a breakage between the agency and the principal motivation in that, in such that the government knows that effectively one of the people that it makes them in power, or puts them in power, is the unions, which they are going to negotiate the wages with. And therefore you have that linkage where, yes, you give them unions a higher wage, the unions vote for you, as we see with the COSATU government link, and there's always an incentive from politicians to always up things up. As was mentioned now about the Chancellor of University, Vice Chancellor of University, he doesn't own the university, he gets a salary. He can make long-term negative decisions for the university that's going to weaken the fiscal standing of university 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line. It doesn't really matter to him because he just has a job. His job is easier if the protests go away today, irrespective of the fiscal situation of the university 10 years down the line.
Mr. Fosland, if I may just give you this moment to give your concluding remarks. But in your concluding remarks, perhaps enlighten us on the possible consequences of leaving vulnerable people like the people who are dependent on grants, not giving him even real inflationary adjustments, as you suggested. What are the possible consequences?
Well, one direct consequence is, of course, suffering in the families. Whether or not communities can stay calm, or whether or not the protests will increase and political instability increases, well, we will see. But I would like to point out, for those who have time to read the budget review, you should look at page 30 there, and you can see what dangerous trajectory the government is on now, when it's still in the cage of neoliberalism. It speaks about the possibility of a downgrading of the credit rating, because the measures which it has put into place now is by no means a guarantee that the credit ratings institutes, which are very conservative, that they will not downgrade the credit rating of South Africa to so-called junk status. Now, in such a case, the Treasury says on page 30, they will adopt aggressive austerity measures, end quote. I mean, this is complete. I think it's delusional. How can you impose aggressive austerity measures in a country like South Africa, which is already one of the most protest-ridden countries in the world? It's asking for trouble. It's asking for instability, and in the end, you will end up with more and more repression, and you are going for a police state if you're going for such a policy.
Mr. Fosland,
the government, progressive, you must break out from this policy.
That's where we're going to leave it. Very, very briefly, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give the minister?
I will give him 1. I mean, that's
where we're going to leave it. I don't want you to elaborate. Let's leave it there. Scale of 1 to 10?
Scale of 1 to 10, probably a 5. It's a pretty neutral vote. And just talking about the ratings agencies, he has to look at that. If he does not look at that, you have a situation like Venezuela, where yes, you have all these wonderful things where you give effectively more and more subsidies to people that really need it. I have no qualms about saying we need to give more money to the poor. I mean, the amount of money, 300 rands a month for a child, it's like ridiculous. It's nothing. And it's huge, huge benefits in the future. But you can't escape the reality of the fiscal situation.
Viv Govender, Dick Fosland, thank you very much to both of you for gracing us with your presence this evening. Well, we're going to take a quick ad break, and when we return, we bring you our interview with the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Phumulo Masualle. Do stay with us.
Our eyes are the window to the beautiful wonders of the world. But blindness enhances other senses. Technology has made living with blindness easy.
If you look on the side here, it's got like grooves in there. Yeah. So the first one after when it comes together will be 20 Rand, 50 Rand. And if I slide this in, I can see according to the grooves, it's now on 50 Rand.
To Steve Kekana, blindness was never a hindrance, but a blessing.
You got to know that you are the child of the universe, being blind, and you've got the right to be here.
Join your host, Dr. Sello Mutawun, every Saturday from 9 a.m.
Well, Eastern Cape Premier Phumulo Masualle delivered his State of the Province address a week ago. Amongst his key priority areas going forward, education and unemployment in the province. I caught up with him and began by asking him just how his province plans to address the scourge of unemployment and what seems to be a looming education crisis. And that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. It's a goodbye from me.
The first critical thing that we've raised is the revival of the industrial parks. We had in the past year such areas as Dimbaza, Fort Jackson, Vulindlela, in Butterworth. Already working with DTI, we've already begun putting some investment there to improve the infrastructure, rehabilitate the infrastructure, ensure that there is secure environment. So as the pipeline that is already started trickling in, investors are beginning to go into those. We've also consciously said we must package for those investors that can, through our own public spend, we enter into long-term contracts, take-off agreements that we could have with them where they guarantee at least a minimum of 100 permanent jobs that, for instance, those who provide different things that governments buy all the time. For instance, very, very big contracts are going to be spent in the province, Umzimvu, Budem, etc. But the supplies, the things that are going to be used in this, we want them to be sourced from within the province. In that way, we want to create somewhat an incentive way through which we can have the private sector also coming into the party. That is adding to focus on agriculture, particularly the agri-parks. Again, we have had somewhat beginning of enterprise development in those areas. Some production is already taking place. We want to increase the uptake, the footprint of those, spreading it throughout the province, particularly in the areas that have potential.
If I'm an investor, or here comes a business person with hundreds of millions or even billions of rands, and they come to you, they say, Premier, what can we do that will help you, but that will also make money for me? What do you say to that person?
Well, look, certainly we've got to talk. We've got to look together with municipalities. The issue about attracting businesses into our province. There are a lot of things that we must use our own creativity to actually attract them into the province. I think issues starting with some of the electricity costs, where we come to terms, we could actually lower some of those tariffs so that we can have them coming here. But also, I think the President, you may have heard him say that a one-stop shop type of fit that includes departments to make it easier for those who want to invest, not to have these long red tapes, etc. We're looking at a fit like that in the province as well, so that where we have opportunities like this, it's very swift and we can work to actually get and undo all the bottlenecks on the way, such that there is speed in which we could attract such opportunities.
Now, you spend a considerable amount of time talking about education, rebuilding schools, rebuilding the infrastructure and so on. But the problem, it would seem, is still with personnel. There is the issue of teaching, That is a big problem. And as we all know, if the matric results are anything to go by, we are underperforming. We are the worst province. The question then is, how are you going to turn that situation around?
All right. No, thank you very much. We've actually looked into this extensively and identified the areas where the problems are located. And they range across the spectrum, from the school environment, to the immediate support to schools, that is district offices, the circuits, to the provincial office itself in terms of the speed with which things are done in order to support schools. If I may just start with the school itself, there are very good examples that show, with good quality management and leadership in the school, no amount, even in the deepest, we've got very, very sterling examples where there's a very focused, encouraging school principal. We've said, let us focus on that. That's the first layer of leadership in the school itself. Of course, the SGBs, many of the problems, without me appearing to be apportioning blame there, when that system doesn't work collectively, collaboratively, there's got to be some systemic failures right at the school. Remember, the appointment of educators is delegated, it's taking place there. Many a times we find some of the recommended or appointed educators are actually not even qualified properly for that. But the other area, perhaps just to do with teaching in the school, we want to pay particular attention, leadership, but also teacher availability. The turnaround time to secure teachers in front of learners, it's one of the things that we've had to send a team in the Department of Education to assist their human resources component, so that we can focus on speeding up the turnaround time in the appointment of educators. That's to make sure that the schools are actually not hamstrung by absence of educators. But secondly, another area critically of emphasis is the arrangement of support to schools, the district offices. We probably the province with the largest number of districts, we're reducing them so as to concentrate and have skills in the district offices closer to schools. There is going to be a restructuring of those districts. From 23, we're reducing them to 12 with a little bit of focus, as well as raising the level of delegation and the leadership in terms of the management that should be in those areas. And of course, at the head office itself, there's too many things that are done there. Perhaps we should have a different way. You see, there are too many things that really come in the way. Procurement, the appointments, that are not directly related to having the classroom environment working. We want to have a learner-focused Department of Education. Some of the things we've got to find another way in which they can be provided. Of course, this cannot be done just by government alone. We want to concentrate a great deal in social mobilization, social awareness. You see, for instance, some of our schooling is just disrupted by people who are protesting about things unrelated to what is happening in the school. I made the example of a community in East London. They are protesting, they need houses, they go and close down a school. We've had a similar case here where parents choose to make their children stay at home. We've got to have a different narrative. Our schools cannot always be the first to be held in ransom whenever there is a miss, because it shows at the end when the results, here we've lost 4 weeks. I still have to see how we're going to make up for that 4 weeks. But I can tell you, it won't compare with other schools. These learners shall have to do catch-ups, but they will never be on par with the others. And the others are the ones in the quintiles 4 and 5. Most of the schools are the quintiles 1 to 3 schools. So in a sense, the education of the poorer child who comes from a poorer background is always the one that is held to ransom in this. So I think we want to have a partnership, the society around how we can secure these improvements in our education system.
Isn't SADTU also an elephant in the room? Are we really being frank in the engagements with SADTU as an organization of teachers? Hasn't this been going on for a very long time?
Look, certainly we must have a very frontal engagement with SATU and other teacher formations on the role that they can play in strengthening the effort to improve our educational outcomes. There are a lot of things that you would say that perhaps had we been doing them differently, perhaps we could be having a different outcome out there. Certainly there are things that must change, not only for SATU, but for all in the chain. A lot has got to change. I'm very clear about that. In the province, we're keeping again, just out of sometimes just sentiment, a far too much number of schools that are unviable. Learner numbers have reduced because people are moving. There's a natural movement of people towards urban environments. And those schools in the deep rural, many of them find themselves with inadequate number of learners, and as such, owing to how you distribute the model for distributing of educators, you've got schools that then have to be distributed far less a number of teachers. And we've got to create, and that's why we've taken a decision that let us create centers of excellence. Rather, let's build schools with hostels so that we can rather have children staying in hostels than to have small scattered schools all around. The other is also just functionality in our schools. Functionality is a function of a number of things. The leadership, the teachers being on class, it's a major contributor to some of the inefficiencies we see in the system.
You spoke a great deal about what you're doing in various or several hospitals here in the Nelson Mandela Metro, but also the extensions and rebuilding being done in places like Umtata and so on. But the dire need, the most dire need, it would seem, is in rural areas. The question is there a plan in place to really deliver, health services or expanded health services in rural areas?
Already, I could say that what is to be overall, we can already see elements of it at a very advanced stage in the areas like OR Tambo, where we, together with the national department, it's a pilot site for the implementation of the health insurance, national health insurance. There, ward-based teams that are already deployed in wards, because basically our emphasis should be on primary health care, preventative health care, so that we strengthen that. So throughout we are going to have ward-based teams that visit people in their homes, and that can ensure that it doesn't take too long to identify where there's a need, and a need is attended to closer there. We're strengthening clinics, and also we're expanding capacity within clinics. There is quite a lot we're doing in that regard, including just the revitalization of some of our hospitals that are deep in the rural hinterlands. Our program of infrastructure development is touching on those hospitals as well.